I know.
Hey guys, so we're gonna begin. So thank you all for coming tonight to our event hosted by the Palestine Solidarity Alliance of Hunter College. We'll be having two guest speakers tonight, Lamis Deek and Eran Efrati.
You could just, like, one sentence introduction.
Okay. So Lamis is a Palestinian human rights attorney and litigator based in New York, and she pretty much works with the Arab American community in the United States and advocates for the rights of Palestinians. In addition to this, Eran Efrati is the executive director of RAIA, apologies, and it's the Researching the American-Israeli Alliance. It's an investigative researcher into the Israeli military, a former director for the ICHD USA, and currently a JVP board member. He formerly served as the chief researcher of Breaking the Silence, where he collected testimonies from hundreds of IDF soldiers and their activities. He's participated in both independent and the UN investigations into Israeli military operations. His investigative reports have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, among others. Today's research is focused on the international military and police partnerships between the US and Israel. So tonight we'll be having
everyone, and this should be already recognized, and we shouldn't emphasize on it. So I don't want to take time off of our speakers, and I'll open the floor for them to speak on the institutional relations and divestment and the cooperation between Israel and the U.S. We'll start with Lamis. Okay.
Yeah. Whatever you prefer.
That's what the camera's gonna.
I can took the presentation and
You know, I think I'm just gonna go there.
Okay.
What should I press?
just the arrows right here.
Perfect. Hey.
Hi.
What's up?
Hi.
Good night. Bon appetit. Good evening. How are you? I'm Eran, and I'm from researching the American-Israeli Alliance. We call ourselves RAIA. RAIA in Arabic is also raising a flag of freedom, of oppression. There are different meanings. And I'm really, really excited to be here tonight. I love that we have a small room, and I hope that we can actually talk. And I'm going to try to do this quickly. I'm not going to talk about myself so much, and I'm not going to use my very privileged Jewish background too much, as well as I'm the token Jewish guy in the room. Try to avoid that. But I'm excited to be here for two main reasons. First is because I admire Lamis very, very much. And for many years now, I'm waiting for the opportunity to speak next to her and listen to her just in any capacity. And the second is that I think that this specific campaign, the CUNY divestment, is one of the smartest, most strategic campaigns that our movement had in recent history. So, except for the fact that it's taking from the moral and important BDS campaign, from the BNC and from the Palestinian people themselves, this campaign specifically, like I think Ronnie just touched on, brings a lot of movement and a lot of causes together. And I don't know if we just talked about how we're bringing movements together. I don't know if maybe we should just thank CUNY for investing in such evil corporations. It's not even a question, how many movements can log into this. So I want to start the evening by saying something that maybe is not going to be so popular in the room. I want to say that you definitely do not have to care about Palestinian life or Palestinian freedom to invest in CUNY divestment. So the next time Zionists are coming around and saying it's around Palestine, or the next time someone's telling you, yeah, but my movement is more important, or I need to care because I'm in a survival mode in NYC or anywhere else in this country. There's a lot of movements, a lot of people that are daily on survival mode, definitely since the last election, but much before that and long before that. The right answer is this specific campaign with Lockheed Martin and G4S and Boeing is a campaign that environmentalists can touch on and log into absolutely, definitely anti-war movement can join in, racial justice, economic justice, all of these movements are coming together to touch on that specific thing. And I want to highlight something, I think it's a little more broad than how we usually used to talking about complicity of companies and organizations. And I want to start with trying to understand who we're really talking about when we're talking about the investment. And we're talking about doing these campaigns and these specific companies, because it's not just about Palestine. But Palestine plays a very, very important role. And the Israeli government, the Israeli military is playing a big role. And the American military is playing a huge role. And this is why I think we should look back and try to picture ourselves and see the American military-industrial complex as one of the bodies that we really want to touch on and really want to talk about. And maybe more than that, I want to talk about, the Israeli-American military-industrial complex. I don't know, can you see the screen? Is that okay? Perfect. So let's keep it like that. I don't want anybody getting tired during the lecture. So when we're talking about the Israeli-American military-industrial complex, we're really talking about a relationship that was built before the State of Israel was even established. So before 48, we're already talking about buying weapons and buying technology and machinery from Americans by the Zionist movement. It's kind of crazy, but there's people working on research and data about that as we speak at NYU and in different places. And the Israeli-American military-industrial complex is one that we need to go to a few stations in the past when we want to start understanding, but maybe two stops are more important than all of them in history. The first is 9/11, and what's happening after 9/11 in the last 15 to 17 or to 16 years since then. And I'm going to go back to that, but the first one that I want to touch about is 2007. In 2007, there's a new military aid package signed between George Bush and the Israeli government at the time, with the head of Ehud Olmert as a prime minister, and that's basically promising Israel $30 billion in the span of 10 years, between 2007 and 2017. $3 billion a year. You might have heard, a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of campaigns around stop the $30 billion or stop the $3 billion or military aid to Israel. And I think that in our movement, a lot of times when we talked about that, we talked about how the US is giving presents to Israel. And a lot of activists would go out in campaigns and ask, why would we give Israel money? Or why would we help Israel? Why would we help support, the occupation or the wall or the siege in Gaza? But I don't think that were the right questions. I think the right questions that should have been asked already then was, who's really benefiting from sending to Israel $30 billion in the span of 10 years? Because although Israel and the States are very close, and although Israel does benefit from this money and the oppression of Palestinians, and I mean benefit in dollar signs in their pocket every day, and not only the military elite, but most Israelis are benefiting from the occupation of Palestine. The US never does something outside of their interest, meaning you don't ever do anything outside of your interest. And when your government represents you, what they're actually doing is taking your money, that's your tax money, and telling you they're sending us to their biggest ally to fight terror around the world because there's terror here and we have to help them, or whatever bullshit you want to throw your way. And what's interesting in the military aid that was signed in 2007 is that we thought it probably is going to be the worst that was ever signed or will ever be signed with Israel. Little did we know that as a last goodbye gift, just before his departure, President Obama decided to sign with Prime Minister Netanyahu a much bigger military aid package. In last September, military aid package from the US to Israel increased to $38 billion of the span of 10 years, between 2017 or 18 to 2028. It's supposed to start right away. And everybody was talking about it in our movement, from wherever I'm coming from, as a researcher inside the movement. And again, I felt that although the campaigns were important and the language was strong, everybody was missing the point. Everybody was talking about how it's the biggest number that the US ever gave to Israel. And the money being spent from your tax money into Israeli occupation is outrageous. And the suffering of Palestinians that we're going to see, and the airplanes and the bombs But nobody talked about one figure that changed dramatically, much more than the 38 billion. So between 2007 and 2017, the military aid package that was signed said that 74% of the money of the 30 billion over 10 years have to go back to American companies and to American institutions and benefit military elite in this country. 26%, 26.4% to be precise, was to keep in Israel for our own military elite, the Israel military elite, to the Israel military industrial complex, and to increase our military spending in Israel with Israeli companies. Building subcontract to companies in the US, or just creating a new form of weapons and technology that we later sell to the worst regimes and dictatorships around the world. But what happened in 2016 was quite fascinating. The US decided to change the number, or President Obama, or the Obama administration, decided to change the percentage that can be spent in Israel to 0. And the percentage that have to go back to the US, to private weapon companies in the US, to 100%. What they actually did was take the power back. So now when you're paying taxes, and they're telling you that your taxes from the roads that are broken, from the education department that is not working, from healthcare that is not guaranteed to people here, and they're telling you it's going to fight terrorism around the world or to protect our best allies, they're actually not telling you that this money is going to the pocket of the chairman of Boeing or Lockheed Martin. This is where the money goes to directly from your pocket. Now, this amount of intervention didn't happen in a way. It didn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of interesting stuff happened between 2007 to 17. I'm not going to go to all of them. I just want to mark that during that time, one of the most interesting things that happened was a military deal that Israel struck with India. India is the biggest weapon buyer in the world. The US were the main supplier of weapons to India, the biggest weapon buyer. Around 2012, Israel passed the US in drone sales and started selling drones directly to India. The US, that is used to using Israel or using Palestinian suffering literally to be translated into dollars, now see Israel as a threat and starting to see them as a major player that need to be shifted from the arena. Now, part of the idea of why this campaign is touching me, or why I think it's so important, is because in the last 10 years or so, I'm going around and I'm having this talk and I'm having conversation in small groups and bigger groups, and we're trying to figure out how are we changing stuff, and how are we getting to the idea or the understanding there's much bigger players in this game that are using the Palestinian sufferer as well as suffering here in the US, in inner city, of people of color, of poor people around this country and around the world to actually make money out of it. And what we're coming out of every time is that we have to act locally. It's going to be super cheesy, but go with me. You have to act locally to impact globally. You have to start here. And when I got the invitation from Ronnie, I thought about immediately about a quote that I really like by James Baldwin. So I wrote it down because I don't want to screw it up. I just love it. So Baldwin said, the paradox of education is that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. And it's so beautiful here, because if we can't make an impact by just talking about us, we have to understand the very deep connection of Lockheed Martin or Boeing or G4S here at home, at this university and around this city and around the town we grew up in and around this country, before we fly halfway around the world to talk about Palestine. And this is where I'm going to my second date. The second date I talked about was 9/11. Immediately after 9/11, in the beginning of 2002, the American police started to send delegations to Israel to train with Israeli police, Israeli military in the occupied territory as a counter-terrorism, performance. They're trying to go there and be prepared. Israel was there already waiting after 9/11, and then we have the answer. We know how to do it. We know how to, do counterinsurgency, and the U.S. went. And I want to break down this delegation pretty quickly of what they are in the last 15 years, because I think that if we're looking for the answer of how these companies that we're going to talk about in this divestment campaign actually making their money, we'll have to look at the performance of the act of this joint training. Because a lot of people are going to try to tell you that the training themselves, and it's half true, are important enough just to talk about them. The idea that American police department that's supposed to serve and protect are going to train in Ramallah, in Nablus, on the Gaza border with the Israeli military in occupation tactics, and then coming back to inner cities in the US and using those tactics on civilians is bad enough, and that's true. But they're not there just to learn how to act violently or how to oppress people of color in this country, because they did it around 100 years before the state of Israel was established. They're going there because behind the scenes there's people that pay a lot of money for this transitioning and these exchanges to happen. So I want to start breaking down quickly what I mean when I'm talking about it. When we're talking about US-Israel state and corporate partnership, we're talking about weapon companies, technology sales by both American and Israeli companies. Some of them are the same company that have branches in Israel, or Israeli companies that have branches here, like Elbit or Rafael. We're talking about joint military training, and we're talking about joint police training. So the types of trainings are always the same. They're always talking about an anti-terror or surveillance or technology. What they're actually doing when you break it down and when you're going around to these trainings, and I was just there last summer following 3 delegations, 2 of them of the ADL that were on the ground in Palestine, what you're really noticing, they are learning about use of weapons, technology, machinery, tear gas canisters, in a way to suppress crowds, and a way to disperse protesters. That is the main event that is going on in all these exchanges. They will go to weekly demonstration, peaceful demonstration in the occupied territories. They will learn how to use different technologies that later on will be brought here to the US, to the use in the cities, in these inner cities. But a lot of those times, this technology is not being made in Israel. It's just being refined in Israel. So what we're really talking about when we're talking about these groups, these delegations that are going to Israel since 2002, we're talking about more than 192 departments from more now, since this list was made, of 39 states. So almost the entire United States is sending delegations to Israel since 2002 to train with the Israeli army. If you look closely, I'm guessing you'll see that your hometown is somewhere there. So, I'm going to do a quick turnaround now and say, except for the police departments, let's say that we accept the idea that police departments here and police agents, and don't really, but let's say that we accept the idea that they need training against terror. Let's say that they need these counterparts with the Israeli police. The problem is that the American police are not the only one traveling to Israel and training with the Israeli army. The other agencies include university police, of course, ICE and border police from the start, from 2002, the transit patrolling, the MTA. The MTA was there already in 2002, learning anti-terror and anti-war tactic in Israel with an occupying army on the borders of an occupying land and occupying people, and then brought it back. Again, not only police officers, not only military personnel that of course are there, FBI, CIA, we're talking about MTA agents that are training the same training as all the others on the ground. You can see the SWAT teams in criminal justice and drugs and everybody there. And this is a partial list of all of them. So who's funding this? Some of the people that are funding this is the state. So you have federal grants, and you have the Israeli government grants, and you have military surplus donations that are going from Afghanistan and Iraq and different places in Yemen into these delegations to go train in Israel. But there's also 501c3 nonprofits. There's also all these organizations that are getting these benefits from the states. Some of them will be the Jewish institutions like AIPAC, ADL, GINSA. All of them are sponsoring these delegations. All of them are actually paying millions of dollars in the course of 15 years to send this delegation. Not all of them are Jewish, and I'm definitely not saying it's a Jewish issue, but it's also not only a Zionist issue. The question is, why is the ADL, why is AIPAC, why is GINSA are playing this game with those companies, with the bigger people that are pulling the strings? Eran will also occasionally try to map not only this training and not only the weapon that actually came from Israel and had made its way refined in Israel or actually created in Israel and made its way to the US, into cities, into the hands of police here. We'll also try to track surplus military gear that is around us. So again, not only police are using it, some of these weapons are in universities, by universities guards. Some of them will be given to transit authority to have in possession of them. If you look back, we're not talking about just, and I'm saying it with a heavy heart, not just M16s or rifles. We're talking about helicopters. We're talking about armored vehicles. We're talking about full body gear. We're talking about what we see in 2014 during Ferguson and before that and since then. We're talking about a military state with militarized police that is training with military in Palestine. So now we'll get into the last part, and I promise it's going to be really quick from now on. The actual companies that this university is invested in. So we could have brought, thousands of companies and organizations and movement that are talking about the injustice in Palestine and the racial injustice here and the police violence and the state violence in this country. But all these only four examples that we brought was just companies that these universities and the CUNY system is investing in. Some of them are just weapon companies. This is freaking insane. I don't know, you're sitting here, you look pretty cool with that. I mean, I'm not implying that you are, but you look pretty used to that. I don't know, did you know that? Did you know that the CUNY system is investing in private weapon companies? So Boeing is not a private weapon company, but they're very famous for making the Apache helicopters that killed thousands of people in Gaza in the last 10 years. They also made the F-15, Eagle fighter jets that are also used in Israel on Gaza and also were used in the Second Intifada, using the Hellfire missiles that literally killed families and families and families across Palestine and not only different areas of Africa, places of Asia. We're talking about a company that making killing machine every day. We're talking about General Electric, also invested by CUNY, that are making mostly the engine and the electronic boards for this airplane, for the Boeing airplanes, meaning the smart, brain behind the airplane. I once had an encounter with personnel from General Electric, some of the managers there, and we had in a protest an exchange of things. And one of the things they said is that they don't ask too many questions. That they just make, like a one screw in a machine. And I told them that as a Jew and as someone that his grandma went through camps and lost all of her family there, I do not appreciate the almost sarcasm of saying we're just a screw in a machine that literally killed thousands of people in the last decade. We're talking about Raytheon, a weapon company that this university is invested in. This is crazy, and this is not just about Palestine. This is about militarization of police here. It's about injustice in different areas of the world. It's about war profiteering. It's about actually translating suffering of millions of people around the world into money. And your university is invested in these companies. And the last one, G4S before that, G4S that helped the Apartheid goal in Palestine, that are manning half of the checkpoints now in Palestine. In the last 10 to 15 years, most of the checkpoints between Israel and Palestine, not inside Palestine, but between them, became privatized. So the army is actually not sitting there. G4S is sitting in most of them. So G4S will sit at the checkpoints, or at least hire people, Israelis, ex-military in Israel, that will sit there. But not only that, they will also aim the prisons, the military system prisons in occupied Palestine, and will help them in creating an apartheid state for the last 70 years. And the last one is Lockheed Martin. And I have to say, when I saw that, I was really shocked, because Lockheed Martin is one of the most evil forces sitting in this country right now. And the CUNY system is investing a lot of money in that. And Lockheed Martin, except for everything that you probably already know, is the creator of the F-35. And the F-35 is, in large, what stood behind the largest military aid package in history to Israel last summer. So when Obama signed the deal, the increase of money was actually to cover the F-35, the new airplane that Lockheed Martin just issued to the market, and now is being used by the Israeli military and the Israeli Air Force. But Lockheed Martin didn't stop by just selling hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of airstrikes airplane to Israel. They actually went ahead and publicized in Haaretz. Do you know Haaretz? Haaretz is like the lefty newspaper in Israel, although it's really not that lefty. Yeah. Well, in Israel, that's as left as we have there. And in the Zionist left newspaper sell a full ad in Hebrew to Lockheed Martin. Again, a private American company buying a full page ad to talk with Israelis directly. And why wouldn't they? You pay them the money to do that. So after the airplanes arrive, they're sending this ad saying, Mazal tov Israel, congratulations Israel, the F-35, the Adir they call it, the great one, is coming home soon. Coming home soon. And it just blew my mind. Never in the history of the state, and I was involved in some of that, in some of the state violence in the last decade, previous decade. Did an American private company talk directly to Israelis and try to sell us on something that they already gave us? But what really blew my mind was that they used the word home. Because I felt like they were getting me, you know? Like more than most people get me. They're getting me because it is home. This is Palestine. And there it is Harlem. It is Queens. It is Brooklyn. And people there on the ground understand that. They understand what the American police and Israel military understood already 15 years ago. They understand that Palestine is here. They understand that if we want to stop anything over there, we have to start here, locally, to affect globally, in your university. In the next few months, Raya is going to issue two things. A database that is open to the public and open source to everybody and free to use of the US map with location on it, included with the GPS that lets you touch your location and tell you which police departments or other agencies around you were in Israel in the last 15 years and trained there and are using these tactics and weapons around you. And the second is an app that we're going to send out, again, under the name Palestine is Here, to locate the same things and these agencies. So stay tuned to that, and thank you so much for being a part of it.
It's an honor. I've also been a big fan. I get a little uncomfortable in these situations, so I'll keep it short, and I'll save my flattery for private. But thank you for that introduction and for all your great work. And a special thanks to all of you. I'm going to have a different spin and end with the same conclusion, of course, and obviously. And I'm going to talk about what I think is important for us to remember, and then bring it back to the individual and personal benefit of undertaking this work, but begin with a larger moral, ideological compass in all of this, and begin discussing the Palestinian situation, and we'll bring it back to how this affects us individually here. And to give context to that and to what Eran was talking about earlier, it's, I say, and I've begun saying that, and it's long been said actually by Palestinians, Arabs, and perhaps even the global South, that the liberation of Palestine is critical for regional and therefore global peace. Now, this is not by any means a rhetorical statement, and my hope is to tie that down, building on what Eran said. To do that, we begin by contextualizing what is and what are the goals and goals of Israel in Palestine and therefore globally, right? So I think everybody is now comfortable or familiar with the idea that Israel is a colonizing entity, that it exists for the purpose of colonialism. And we've all, I'm sure at this point, also learned about the French colonization of Algeria, for example. So we're familiar with how colonization works, and we must also be familiar with the fact that it's pretty much ended, at least in its direct form, everywhere but in Palestine. But what's very particular and unusual about the Palestinian or the Israeli form of colonization is, unlike other colonizations, often which sought land and resources and did take and access that land and resources by subjugating the people, Israel took it one step farther, right? So it's a settler colonialism project. So then it needed settlers, a settler pool, and thus a myth and propaganda. But above and beyond all that, its clearly articulated public purpose has always been the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, right? So it is a colonial project with the express purpose of ethnic cleansing, and that's very much unlike the other colonizing projects that we've seen. Even the American, the British colonizing project, while it undertook those actions, didn't so expressly, clearly, and strategically prepare for the ethnic cleansing of the native population, the indigenous population, in the same way that the Israelis did. So all of these institutions that Eran was talking about having come into existence before 1948 came into existence specifically for the purpose of colonization and ethnic cleansing. So they were prepared from the onset. It wasn't a reaction to Palestinian uprising and resistance, but rather incoming. That was the intention. And so from inception, Zionists and Israel knew that and required violence as their main force, and continued to live on violence as their main source, not just of colonization, but even of economy, right? And this has expanded into what we're seeing now. As this began to fail, both the propaganda that gave cover for a lot of what the Israelis and the Zionists were doing, the death of the myth, a land without people for people without land, the eternal victim that's needed to defend itself, that quickly fell apart. Especially around 2009, with the advent of social media, the explosion of social media and the exposure, that began to fall apart. And so the violence that Israel has very successfully used against the Palestinians and their supporters globally began expanding its circumference to people, to allies in the US, from the Black community to the Asian community, to any civil rights group or anybody who was remotely suspected of eventually having sympathies for the Palestinians, to now increasingly against the Jewish community, and the Jewish community in Palestine and the Jewish community in Israel. And I think that's wonderful, because this is relevant to you in that it divorces Israel from its Jewish identity and from assuming the role, right, claiming to speak for and represent and be the protector of the Jewish people, the very same people they're violently repressing and oppressing and seeking to imprison even now in Palestine. And so that's something that I hope that you will use as one of your talking points, right? That the circumference of Israeli violence is now against Jewish people, and so you cannot equate BDS work with anti-Semitism. And so knowing that Israel has always held itself out and was the inheritor of British colonialism and the torchbearer of American and generally European colonialism in the region, and looking at what Eran was discussing.
For the sake of Palestinians, but for the sake of creating a better world for yourselves and for people globally, is then what does it mean to create a society and institutions, social, cultural, economic, that are the antithesis of violence, that build peace and sustainability and self-sufficiency for communities, and that do not depend on the military-industrial complex. And I think that that's what we should begin to offer once these conversations become nuanced. Because what I'm seeing in the Zionist-funded movement is as our conversations become more nuanced and detailed, and they're becoming more nuanced and detailed specifically because the Palestinian Solidarity movement is growing intellectually, politically, philosophically, has more knowledge, more information, right? They're also upping their ante and they're preparing in ways we haven't seen. They come to our lectures, and as we proceed, they start preparing their talking points and all of this. So I think it would be great if you could offer also talking points for your vision of what a just, sustainable, and holistic society and economic model of investment looks like. So as we're entering and talking about, hey, divest, well, what is it that you'd like to see happen instead, right? Not just the refusal to participate, but a reimagining. And BDS should be the catalyst for this, right? BDS is really posed, and that's the goal at its essence, right? In terms of supporting Palestinians, BDS is the absolute bare minimum you could do. If you're not boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning, you are actively participating in the murder, ethnic cleansing, dispossession, abuse, and torture of Palestinians and Arabs in the region. If you look at, the Israeli presence in Iraq or in Syria or in Egypt or in anywhere, right? So it's the very least you could do for the Palestinians. But what you're doing for your own community and for your own school, when you're saying, divest, is what you're saying, let's repivot. Let's repivot the economic model that this institution, this university is using to one that is just, safe, holistic, and long-term sustainable. Because the war industry, like the housing market and all of these, is a bubble industry. It all depends on overvaluation, and it all depends on keeping various classes, and I'll get back to it. So imagining what we can do, and even if you're not yourselves doing this, by demanding divestment, bringing these resolutions, by demanding transparency, you're making the institutions, this university's administration, do their research and do their homework. Usually, they delegate this to third parties. They have brokers and, I don't even know that language. I'm not an economist. I went to law school, so I didn't have to do math. But so we don't, they have third parties and outside parties, and usually these outside parties are tied to all of these interests that Eran referred to. They're one big happy family. They work far more intimately than many of us have the opportunity to do because they have the resources, the capacity, and strong motivation to do so. But once you start demanding transparency, now the administration at least has to answer questions, and in answering those questions, has to look at, well, where is it exactly going, and how, is it actually good? They have to start, and they should start making those calculations as they prepare those calculations for you. So this is phenomenal. I'll give you an example, and it's not the best example, but you look at the green movement in corporations, right? All of these economic fines and EPA regulations. I mean, they were coming down for a period of time in my era. They were coming down quite hard on corporations that weren't EPA compliant. I mean, they were getting billions of dollars out of these corporations. So what did these corporations do? They started actually adopting green practices, not because they gave a hoot. I just said hoot. Jesus, I am old. Not that they gave a hoot, not that they cared about the environment, but there was a financial incentive to reevaluate and reconsider their own practices so as to avoid liability. And that's what you're pivoting, these corporations towards. And G4S, we look at that, it's not a real victory, but on some level it's a small victory, right? It fine-tuned some of its oppressive practices in Palestine, but that's still progress. It's not what we want, it's never enough, it's nowhere near enough, dismantle it for God's sake, but it's still progress. And this is really what you're doing by asking for divestment, which is quite brilliant, right? I mean, this is for the sake of everybody. And even better, it's the sake for our own workers and our own economies here, right? So when you think about who's making money on this, right? Soldiers are going to get killed. They're usually the poor people. Palestinian workers are I'm sorry?
I said I'm not making money from this.
Right, exactly, right? Palestinians are there to be, maybe just a crux above slave labor. If folks know how working for Israelis is like in Palestine, you might not ever get your wage. You'll probably get robbed by soldiers on the checkpoints. It's abusive beyond imagination.
And then we
here they
say,
are-
and then we say that BDS hurts Palestinian workers.
Right. So then they're creating this really oppressed labor market that competes with workers globally, right? So it really, divestment is critical, literally, for everybody, even the Palestinian workers that they use as a straw argument. So BDS is a very, very tangible incentive. The other aspect, which is the political and kind of legal aspect, or the more political aspect, aside from the economic, is that BDS also helps us track, identify, unravel, and expose the really intimately intertwined institutions, Israeli Zionist or otherwise violent institutions that have been embedded into our own institutions, right? I think people are sometimes they're really unaware of the level of minutia coordination between Israel and the U.S. government, and between Israel and the U.S. institutions and corporations generally. And one of the reasons that Israel has been able to do this, and Zionist organizations from AIPAC and many others who pose as 501c3s, is that they've been able to operate under the cloak of darkness. Right? And this is very empowering for them. And this is another reason why BDS becomes so important, because in order for you to make these demands, you actually have to go there and say, well, this is what's happening, and these are the people we need to divest from, and this is what they do. And so you're uncloaking this, the veil of darkness under which they operate, which keeps them empowered, right? Like, this is critical. People don't know this. They also don't know about the detailed coordination and how the daily lives, the minutia of your own daily lives, are impacted by the Israeli U.S. government, New York government, state government relationships. And some of you might know about this, but I'm going to start with a larger example and then talk about how it affects literally your daily lives in school. The NYP Demographics Unit, who here has heard of that? Michaela, wow, okay. See, it's unfortunate that you guys don't know about this, because it's still in place, actually. The NYP Demographics Unit, now, I worked on helping unravel this, because before it became acceptable to support and kind of stand in solidarity or be legal defense or community defense for Palestinians or pro-Palestine solidarity, the Arab Muslim community, especially after 9/11, my office was basically frontline triage, especially for the Palestinian community, vis-a-vis all of these really repressive, Patriot Act and Patriot Act equivalent measures that were taken in New York. And so many of the people and institutions that were named, and there was a leak of these reports. Somebody from the NYPD leaked reports to AP reporters, Matapuzzo, and I always forget the other guy's name, Adam Goldman, and he's the one I was in closer contact with. But anyway, Matapuzzo and Adam Goldman. But so many of those names, almost all of them, were people that I personally knew, represented, defended, whether it was formally within a courtroom or just vis-a-vis FBI or NYPD contact, or physically defended from unknown harassers that were clearly tied to the government. And so the reason that this became controversial, and it couldn't have come at a better time, because that's when we found out we were infiltrated, was just at the same time that this was being exposed, was that the NYPD Demographics Unit, by that time, and for a long time, the NYPD had actually an office. It's not just that they're exchanging, they had an office in Palestine. Of which they were very, very, very proud. And the Demographics Unit was a secret unit that was getting secret money funneled into it, illegally or beyond the scope of regulations that were permissible. And it was copied, built in coordination with, and I'm sure at the behest of the Israeli government, copied exactly on the same mechanisms and tools that the Israeli occupation uses against Palestinians in the West Bank. Consider that. Not that they use against Palestinians in the 1948 territories, aka Israel, but on military occupation tactics, and if anybody's familiar with military occupation tactics, we're talking about extrajudicial assassination, surveillance of Big Brother proportions, where they can track your phone and bomb you to death from your cell phone, right? Tanks, you name it. So they emulated this exact system in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, in places where they weren't allowed to operate, right? And so what we did have information on, because we never got the full story of the demographics unit, we never got transparency. What we did know was absolutely disgusting. I had one friend / client, wonderful man, businessman, has all of these children. His children go to school. Never had an issue. He did have issues in Palestine. He was arrested as a teenager in Palestine. He was kidnapped by the colonizing forces as a teenager, and not even for engaging in resistance activities, but for being a Palestinian living in Palestine. And since that time, Israel had targeted him. Now, why would the US be so, or the NYPD be so committed to this guy without this really intimate coordination? He also happened to be somebody who was quite charming and could reach people. And so for his case, which was not an unusual case, he had 4 layers of surveillance on him and on his children at home and in his place of business. Let me give you an example of what these layers are. There was a camera placed in his television set at home. There were numerous cameras placed in his place of business. There was, the 4 layers, as I recall, were called, there was camera surveillance, there was a uniformed officer constantly monitoring him, at least one, right? We had to decode a lot of this because a lot of this was coded in language we didn't know. There was a confidential informant, and then there was something else that was called secondary, and we still haven't figured that out, okay? So examples of what he and his family were experiencing, the level of harassment and attention that they gave this man and his family was just him and handcuff him to a radiator, 14 years old, handcuff him to a radiator for like 4 or 5 hours, refusing him access to his parents. And this is the case of just one person. So imagine the resources that were dedicated to this one person who was, in the a wonderful man, but in the context of activism and mobilizing, not so relevant. So imagine then what's reserved for the rest of us. We had, from the demographics unit, we were able to find out, we had 2 infiltrators in our organization, in Al-Auda, 2 cops that were assigned just to Al-Auda. This operation began actually in 2000 or 2001. Detective Stephen Pinkall, who was a CIA flunky, who used to come to our rallies, come to our rallies and try to provoke young Palestinian men so that he can get an arrest. We recognized him when he came to court eventually. He had followed Al-Auda, which is not a very big organization. I think our biggest budget ever was $5,000, without exaggeration, for like 3 years, right? Wow. Not a big organization. They dedicated 2 NYPD officers to our organization, dating back to at least 2000, right? And these same NYPD infiltrators, we later learned from the NYPD demographics unit, released leaks that they hadn't just infiltrated the Arab and Muslim groups, but they had infiltrated Malcolm X grassroots movement. They had infiltrated the prison abolitionist groups that we worked with. They had gone to what's the socialist conference that happens in Michigan? They had gone to this huge socialist we actually paid their damn ticket to go as representatives, right? And they had used Al-Auda to build their credibility, because we were really heavy and big on campuses before all of this happened. And we had to retreat because we had to deal with the blowback and the youth that were impacted and the communities that were impacted, and actually providing them legal defense. But they had used Al-Auda, which, for all that you can say in critique, has, I think, unquestionable credibility, especially in the Arab community. They used our credibility to then infiltrate pretty much every MSA that we ever had contact with, recording them and trying to set up arrests. Now, what's interesting about these arrests, and what came out of this, they couldn't get any of us, alhamdulillah, right? We weren't doing anything illegal. They tried, goodness. I ended up representing one. Look at the minutia. One of the officers set up a fake altercation with, he was an undercover unknown to me, with a fake altercation with another officer. apparently they had been trying to get me to represent people so they could find something on me, disbar me, get me imprisoned. So I ended up representing the NYPD undercover officer, who I thought was one of our members, in a court case against a uniformed officer. Shortly thereafter, having failed, to get any of us, imprisoned or prosecuted, they set up this young, very, very ill, mentally ill man who recently hung himself in Attica, actually. I don't know if anybody caught that case last April. Yeah. He's alive, but not in good shape, as you can imagine. They set up this mentally ill young man who was getting picked up by the NYPD, taken to Bellevue and Elmhurst for mental health institutionalization since he was 16 years old, and set him up for a terrorism case. And it was such an outrageous case that even the FBI gave statements against it. That's how outrageous a case it was, how tenuous it was. I mean, there was nothing there. It was clear that this was a complete entrapment case. Well, why? Right? Now, before the arrest, it was brilliant. Before the arrest, NYPD had called all the media. Right? They had called the New York Times. They had called so much media. Why? Right? Because New York has this huge terrorism case, right? It was the first New York State terrorism case under New York State terrorism laws post 9/11. First purely New York State terrorism laws, because they wanted money, right? All of this, all the money that was funneled into the NYPD, they wanted to get it back from the federal government and convince the rest of you and the rest of these societies that we needed it. And guess what? While this was happening in coordination with Israel and the Zionist groups, guess who else got money? Right? The same Zionist groups that now needed funding to protect themselves from these terrorist organizations or these terrorist plots, all of which are completely manufactured. Completely manufactured. So look at how cyclical and intimately coordinated this is. And you stand at the crux of being able to deconstruct in detail, and it requires a really detailed work and analysis, and people like Eran Efrati are here to do that. Kali Yakuno and so many other people are really stepping up to the plate to kind of parse through this, but you have the role of divorcing these relationships which directly threaten each and every one of you, I think in ways that not only you don't know, but probably can't imagine. I mean, that's how dangerous this is. Looking at the economic argument for BDS, we touched upon it. We didn't talk much about the environmental destruction that's caused by supporting and participating in corporations that depend on war, which necessarily depends on the destruction of our environments. Everything from water to soil to air pollution, right, is impacted by this. So you're talking about long-term environmental health, which is a planet that we can live on. There's another point here that I forgot. Oh, right. Well, we talked about the class dynamics and the workers. The last argument for why BDS, and I'm building on the questions that were left, is really it works, right? I mean, it's not going to liberate Palestine. I mean, I'm just going to tell you point blank, it's not going to liberate Palestine. And there's a huge schism between the progress that we're making internationally on the issue of Palestine and the reality of conditions for Palestinians back home. I mean, just the worst it's ever been. So as self-congratulatory as we are, and I am, about the progress of the international solidarity movement, the reality is this is the worst it's gone, and it's going to get worse, and in ways, again, that we can't imagine. But it works, right? And it's worked. We always use South Africa as an example, and the dynamics there differ, but it's worked historically in the U.S., right? Before the Civil War, black people and their white allies were engaging in BDS tactics to push for slave abolition, not just in the U.S., but cross-Atlantic slavery, right? Montgomery, Alabama, the bus boycotts, right? They've worked. And South Africa, of course, they've worked, and we've seen them work in the case of Palestine, and they work not only to help repivot, because it's not, it might help repivot somewhat in Palestine, but it works in terms of helping repivot the institutions and the societies under which you're living, and and to which you're subject, right? You're subjects of these institutions. You are operating within them. So it works. It has a history and precedence of success. I missed one link, looking at the NYPD demographics unit and the relationship between security, Israeli institutions, and U.S. institutions. In all of this, while this money is being funneled back into Israel or Zionist institutions, you have this cycle, right, this money cycle, because that's really what it is. It's keeping the money in the family. While you have this money is being then funneled into your institutions, and it's being funneled into your institutions on conditions. And those conditions, whether you are conscious of it or not, are impacting your curriculum, what books you read, and therefore whether and how much free thought you have, right? And so this is also the more direct minutia relationship. I'll leave you at that, and hopefully I didn't go on too long and we have time for questions and answers.